Today I want to talk about how open science principles apply to problems with peer review and how they might help mitigate some of the effects of bias and lack of transparency and accountability that we've been discussing for the last 3 days. So just quickly, open science is a very broad concept, and it involves a lot of very different practices. Open access to publications, opening data, opening software and methods and protocols, opening participation beyond the academy to the public and others. But it also involves applying principles of transparency and participation to methods of evaluation of research and researchers, and also to our peer review processes. So when we talk about open science, we talk about a bunch of very different practices, and moving to open access to publications obviously is its very own basket of problems compared to moving to open data or citizen science or so on. And these, the aims that we have in mind when we try to move towards these practices are very often very diverse. I keep this slide. This wasn't a very rigorous study. In 2015, I just asked on Twitter what people thought were the principles of open science, and this is the answers that I got. So we see here it's very much about transparency, accountability, inclusivity, responsibility, and so on. The point I want to make is that all those practices associated with open science can be motivated in different ways by these different aims. And the ways that those aims align with those practices will influence the types of open science systems that we might want to aim for or get in the end with the policies that we implement. Okay. So back to peer review. Peer review as we know it, it's generally anonymous in some way, so either double blind or single blind. So usually at least the reviewers are unknown to the authors. It's usually opaque, meaning that neither the process nor the reviews are made public. And really, maybe only the editor sometimes has the full overview of the process that a paper has gone through. And it's usually selective. There's a gatekeeping, and it's inherent in the word peer, of course. Who is a peer and who gets to decide who is a peer is a question. So usually within the peer review system in journals, which is mainly what I'm talking about today, reviewers are selected by editors. So it's a cliche, of course, that peer review is a black box. And it's a black box because there's a lot of things we don't know about it in terms of the evidence, but also just in terms of the processes that happen in shaping the evaluation and critical guidance of our scientific literature. There's a lot that we just don't know. Decisions are made in the shadows. And as scientists, we might wonder whether this is the best way to go about things, especially given everything we know about the problems with peer review, which we've talked at length about for the last few days, and I won't dwell on here. But there are problems with the amount of time it takes. This is a great meme by Michael Eisen. There's problems with accountability and biases and incentives and wasted effort. So I won't talk about those in detail, but just to say that these are all obviously very different problems, and the solutions to these problems might be very different. And finding ways to put in place solutions which prioritize certain, addressing certain of these problems might lead us to different systems. So to move on to talk about open peer review. So in my conception, in my definition, open peer review is an umbrella term for a number of overlapping ways that peer review models can be adapted in line with the aims of open science. But inherent in this, and given what I've said, the aims of open science are very, very diverse, and the ways in which peer review models can be adapted are very, very diverse. And mixing these together means that we come to a very, very diverse landscape of ways that open science principles can be adapted or applied to peer review. So as background, after my PhD, I gave up on academia. In 2015, I went to work for an infrastructure implementing open science, but one part of this was a research task, look at open peer review and how it applies to open science. So I was new to the open science, to the peer review community then. This is my first peer review congress, by the way. And the first task I had was just figuring out what the hell people were talking about when they were talking about open peer review. And I quickly realized that very often they were talking about very, very different things. So in an attempt to just get my head straight, I went to the literature and I actually went through and collected all the definitions of open peer in the literature, open peer review in the literature that I could find via systematic review. I then coded and analyzed them for what particular aspects of openness were they talking about in any specific case. And so I collected 122 definitions from the literature and managed to code or find 7 distinct ways principles of openness might be applied to peer review in those cases. And they're listed here in order of prevalence, really. So open identities is non-anonymous peer review, meaning reviewers or identities are known to authors and or signed next to papers. Open reports, meaning that the peer review reports are published. Open participation, meaning that the process of selecting who is a peer is opened up and reviews can be crowdsourced or so on. And if we think back to that slide I showed you at the moment, at the start, that said that open peer review was usually anonymous, opaque, selective, these 3 traits all address one of those issues, but they're very different issues. I also found that they were associated with some secondary aspects, in particularly opening up interaction between reviewers and maybe authors as well, putting manuscripts online, allowing commenting on final versions and open platforms. And so the next step then was to identify from the literature what the evidence was for these interventions. And so here, this is still from the 2017 paper, and I would refer you there. But this is the benefit and drawbacks with an asterisk to say that one of the main findings from that paper, as I'm sure you can all guess, is that there wasn't that much evidence. There was a lot of opinion, a lot of assertion, but not a massive amount of evidence, although of course there has been research on this dating back way over 20 years, and in particular from BMJ. But so just to go through the benefits and drawbacks of each of these interventions. So open identities is presumed, so making reviewers sign their name to reviews is presumed to increase the accountability and transparency, maybe mitigate conflict of interest, and maybe mitigate uncivil interaction that happens when people are anonymous. From the internet, I'm sure we know how the cloak of anonymity can make people voice their opinions in not such kind ways. But the negatives were that reviewers would be perhaps exposed to risk of reprisals, especially where there was a status imbalance, a junior reviewing the work of a senior, for example, or that because of this risk that they might blunt their opinions and not give their forthright opinion on a paper. For open reports, the positives were wider scrutiny of review processes, potentially increasing review quality, credit, and reward for review work. The fact that just having peer reviews online allows people who haven't peer reviewed before to see what a peer review looks like, which is very often a main training resource for peer reviewers. And the problem of predatory journals. If the main problem of predatory journals is that they're claiming to do peer review but not doing it, asking them to publish the review reports might help them evaporate. Although thinking about this, with what we know about machine learning and so on, they might just evolve further to find some way to create review reports. But the negatives were thought that possible higher refusal rates to review, so people wouldn't want to review under this condition maybe. They might increase the time taken to review, and that some authors might not want criticisms of their paper which have now been addressed when the paper is published to be exposed. And then finally, open participation. The positives: wider scrutiny of review presses, more eyeballs per paper, potentially increasing review quality, credit, and reward for review work. Sorry, this is the same. This is a typo. With open participation, more eyeballs per paper, opening the pool of reviewers beyond these silos which we know exist. People tend to invite reviewers that they know, and very often people who are like them. So a follow-up, we surveyed attitudes to open peer review. In this paper published in 2017, more than 3,000 responses from authors, reviewers, editors. And we found that 76, more than 3/4 already had some practical experience of one or more of these 7 traits of open peer review, but that 60% believed that open peer review should be common practice in some regard. There were positive reactions to most of the traits of open peer review, in particular, this model of open interaction. So bringing more interaction between reviewers to come to consensus on papers, or to bring reviewers into dialogue with authors. But also open reports and enabling comments on final versions were very highly favored. There was strong rejection of open identity, so almost half were against. And again, this links back to these worries about issues of status, power, and how these might shape conversations. So we heard in the, well, throughout the conference, but also in the words from Drummond Rennie that Paul Glasziou quoted, that to me, it's a profound and sad irony that so much of what we know about peer review, or think we know, is not based on peer-reviewed evidence. And so just to point to this paper from 2020, where me and my good friend John Tennant, who's no longer with us, we mapped the limitations to our understanding of peer review, tried to identify gaps in the literature, and map a way forward for peer review research. And with that in mind, I said that the 2017 paper hadn't found so much. What have we learned in the last 5 years since then? So in preparation for this talk, with a colleague from Aarhus University, Serge Horbach, we started a new systematic review. I heard in a talk the other day that systematic reviews are down to 2 weeks in some areas, definitely not where I live. So this is still work in progress. But we were basically looking for evidence of attitudes to open peer review, evidence of uptake, or attitudes of the efficacy of these interventions. And in what remains, I'll just go through some of these findings. So the first thing is that the literature is definitely growing. So that query across all of Scopus over the last 20 years shows that the number of articles published on peer review, open peer review, is going up sharply since 2017. It's more than doubled from 50 papers a year to 100. I should say these aren't all the papers about open peer review, because we didn't examine each and every one of these papers going back 20 years. And a lot of what appears when you search for open peer review is because journals say that the manuscript was handled with open peer review in the abstract. So to publishers, please don't do that. This was our Prisma study, just showing how we selected the literature. But the main thing to notice here is that we found basically 64 studies, 55 by database searching, 9 through snowballing and free searching. We charted the data. We looked for the study aims, relevance to which element of open peer review, and whether it related to evidence of uptake, efficacy, or attitudes, and so on. And so these are some provisional findings. So of those 64 manuscripts, we found that 45 were relevant to opening identities, 40 of them relevant to open reports, and only 15 relevant to open participation. We classified them internally just for our own processes, but only 8 of them were really classed as highly important for our study, 29 medium. And here we can see kind of how what these studies are looking at. So in order, A, B, C, D, evidence of uptake, attitudes, or efficacy. And we can see that still a lot of peer review research is based on surveys and attitudes, but there is quite a lot of evidence now on efficacy as well. Okay, so what did we find from this literature? The first thing is about uptake, and this is the most comprehensive study of uptake so far. It's a couple of years old, so and things are moving quickly. So Wolfram et al. Identified over 600 journals operating some kind of open peer review which involved reviewers revealing identities or reports being published. And they found that there's been steady growth. We can see a spike, especially in the last 5 years or so. Adoption most prevalent in medical and scientific disciplines. You'll see that the only bar which kind of starts above 0 is in medical and health at 2001. But the 5 publishers are responsible for 81% of the identified open peer review journals. This isn't the 5 biggest publishers. So the open access publisher MDPI, for example, accounts for a large chunk of this. But they found that early adopter publishers have implemented open peer reviews in different ways with different levels of transparency. So the evidence that we have related to how these different modes of implementation will still be quite thin, given we only found 64 papers, and it's a lot of kind of different configurations of open peer review that we're discussing. But the findings from our literature from the last 5 years. So uptake and evidence are growing sharply, but there's still a long way to go. There's lots of surveys and case studies on small select populations, some specific disciplines with 1 or more journals. The findings regarding skepticism of attitudes to open identities does seem stable across the literature. There is a finding that male and senior reviewers are more likely to sign reviews than women or juniors or more junior researchers in the option where signing reviews is optional. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But open reports have little effect on difficulty in attracting reviewers, but there is differences in uptake across disciplines. With quality of reports, there's some evidence that reports are longer, but it's unclear how this relates to quality. Longer reports, to me, don't necessarily indicate greater quality of reports. And on open participation, there's very little direct new evidence. The evidence we did find was usually limited to kind of 1 question in a survey or so. So what are the evidence gaps that emerge from this literature? And so if there's a point to my talk today, it's really, we have the community of peer review researchers here. And here's a list of things which I really would love to see evidence on, and I would love if you took up. So in general, how do these models apply to the review of other objects, including data, monographs, and funding? How are power structures affected by open identities, including when that's optional? So especially if more senior or male authors are more likely to sign their reviews, and especially when we think of the prestige economy of academia, where visibility is key, how might this shape the visibility of those researchers who are probably already the most visible? So our biases enabled early career researchers and other demographics disadvantaged. In reports, who is using OPR? Who is using the reports? Is anybody using them? We don't really have any evidence if are they being used and how does that impact trust in scientific research? And then in participation, it's a great idea to crowdsource reviews, but how can open participation be incentivized and scaled? And this is my last slide, Theo, I know I'm over. But what are the open issues? So we need better standards, and we need to make better use of the standards that we already have to make the reviews that we do publish more findable, reusable, and citable. Still, some are just a copy and pasted into a PDF and published as supplementary materials. We need more transparency, being clear on peer review policies and their implication for reviewers and authors. I can point you to a paper that we published which showed that most peer review policies are pretty unclear. We need to share data more systematically for large-scale analysis. We had this announcement from Elsevier, which I really applaud, of opening up their data. Maybe we can do this across funders in a very systematic way. And of course, we need more money. With that, open for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I can see the questioners queuing up already, so we'll start over here.
Hi, my name is Gunter Eisenbach. I'm from JMIR Publications and also the University of Victoria in Canada. We are an open science publisher, and we have implemented these open review principles since the beginning. So open peer review, we've been doing this since 1999. All our reviews are credited at every published article. And since 2009, we also have the open participation model where authors can opt in to expose their submitted manuscript as a preprint, and everybody can sign up as a review. So we have tons of data, actually. If you don't find anything about it, then it's my fault because we never published about it. So this is for me a motivation to actually publish about it. But the question for us as an open science publisher is we don't have any control group, right? So it's hard to answer some of these questions. But anecdotally, I want to give you 2 points. So you had on your slide on draws and on benefits and negative points. One thing that needs to be acknowledged is the risk if you have an open participation model that people start gaming the system. So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence and authors who actually created fake identities of reviewers and then started peer reviewing their own manuscript. So that is a risk, and that risk is real. And so
can you wind up your question?
So we have this data set of thousands of articles, some open peer review, some not. How would you, first of all, invitation for everybody to analyze this data, but how would you look at this data? What kind of questions would you like to have answered from a data set like that?
So I'm not completely familiar with your model, sorry, but I mean, all the questions which I had up here, status imbalances, like if signing is optional, who is signing and why? I think we need a lot more evidence on, because a lot of this is based on fear. Like there's a lot of fear that there will be reprisals maybe from, or that people might face blowback further down the line, but whether this actually happens, I would like to believe not. So I'm sure with this invitation to the room, to people to contact you, I'm sure you'll get a lot of emails now asking for your data with a lot of questions which maybe I don't have in my head at the moment.
Michael, do we have some online questions?
Just one. Gerben Turriet of Amsterdam University wants your thoughts on automated peer review or AI solutions to peer review and its relation to open peer review in science.
Yeah, I hate the word AI. It's become such a catch-all for things which, I mean, they're not intelligent. And not necessarily artificial, because very often they're propped up by humans. And the thing is that if you think about software-supported peer review, we've been doing it forever, for a long time, like plagiarism checked and so on. So these are just new tools which can help us to do a task which we will never optimize, just because it will always still be based on opinion. I'm all in favor of it. I think it should be done experimentally to ensure that we don't introduce, and especially with the things that we know about how algorithms are trained on data sets which are already biased. We need to definitely avoid these, but yes, all for it as long as it's evidence-based. Thank you.
Okay, we go over here next.
Thank you. Very much agree with you. AI is a marketing term. Machine learning is a proper term. Anyways, very nice talk, Tony. But you forgot about us, the open source community. We've been doing open peer review for a really long time. Like, GitHub, for example, all the contributions to many of your devices, like all of the iPhones and things like this, are running on software that has been run in an open peer review fashion or has been developed in an open peer review fashion. The other thing I want to add to this, I'm missing Joss in your paper, in your article, which is a Journal of Open Source Software with the editor-in-chief, Arfin Smith, who's actually also doing this. I think there's a lot of data in the open source community about how open peer review works, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
So the parallels between the open science and the open source community are really, really fascinating, because I think the open science community kind of based itself, at least at first, on the open source community. I would say here I was talking about review of journal articles mostly, and obviously review processes could be applied to everything, but they would be very different. In open source communities, there is very heavy community aspect, and there are the kind of the ways in which you can grow into a community by being an active member of a community. This definitely could be a kind of role model for how we might build open participation processes. But at the same time, I think that very often academic communities are quite small and closed. And so doing these kind of processes in the open is limited for that reason. I think you can take evidence from other contexts, but it's always, you can't apply it one-to-one to different contexts.
I think small and closed is a problem. As academia, let's be more open and more collaborative. Thank you very much.
I definitely echo this.
I think we probably only have time for 2 quick questions, so I'll take one here and then the one.
Yeah. Hi, Nihar Shah, Machine Learning and Computer Science Departments at Carnegie Mellon University. A quick comment. In my community, people have tried to design machine learning algorithms for doing the entire review. They're absolutely terrible. If someone says that using it, don't trust them. But question, some folks I know in the Web3 community, they are going beyond this definition of open peer review. And for them, open is everything is in the blockchain.
Yeah.
Even the creation of scientific knowledge is in the blockchain and so on. Do you think this is more of Web3 hype, or do you think there is substance to it?
Well, first, let me say, I loved your talk the other day, and I wish that you'd been here instead of me this morning for a bit longer. Yeah, this DSci community, it seems like they're replicating a whole lot of open science talk as if open science never happened. I really think that the blockchain discussion found its level with NFTs and pictures of bored apes, a way to sell JPEGs to rich people. So no, I'm completely skeptical about everything blockchain, and whenever people say blockchain to me, yes. But I mean, I'm also very biased, and I am very skeptical about a lot of things until I don't have to be. So, but thank you.
Thanks, Usman Munir, Yale School of Medicine. My question was almost the exact same. I was just curious if you felt like in open peer review models, the role of a central arbiter is always necessary, kind of related to the DSci question.
Sorry, could you say that the last part again?
The role of a central arbiter who's governing the open review is necessary, kind of similar to the decentralized science question.
No, I would love it if we could have more decentralized processes. I definitely believe in equity, and I hate the idea of gatekeeping, and the amount that here we've talked about journal prestige and the way that is implicitly or explicitly being equated with journal impact factors. I hate this, and I wish we could get beyond it. But the thing is, open participation communities don't work in academia for peer review yet. When you have these communities, the median number of comments on any article is 0. And usually they are not reviews, they're small. So would love to see it happening, would love more research into how we could make it happen, but I'm not optimistic.
Thank you.